Hello, BookTube, and welcome to our reading of Pride and Prejudice by Jane Austen. I feel like I should jump right in to explosive commentary in this particular episode because things have been happening so fast lately. Our heroine, Elizabeth Bennet, is in the country. She is visiting Mr. Collins and his new wife, Elizabeth's former best friend, Charlotte Lucas. And it's been eventful in a way. Mr. Collins is insufferable. Charlotte Lucas is not the young woman that Elizabeth knew. No open hostilities in either case, but it's not exactly bosom friends like it would be, for instance, if she was staying with the Gardners in London. And also, Mr. Collins' next-door neighbor, his patroness, the Lady Catherine de Bourgh, is not exactly pleasant company most of the time. But the days pass, and there's no great problem. Elizabeth is slated to stay for a certain amount of time and then go. But then suddenly things start happening. Mr. Darcy, whom Elizabeth met in Meryton, in her own country, in the early parts of this book, is suddenly staying with the Lady Catherine de Bourgh. And she's bumping into him all the time. And he proposes marriage to her. Out of the blue. Maybe not to us, but to her. She's totally bamboozled by it. And she refuses in the most clear terms imaginable. She rebuffs him. She doesn't just say, oh no. She rebuffs him violently. And also slurs his character. Tells him the reason that she's rebuffing him is not that she's against marriage, or even marriage to him. It's that she hates him because of things that he has done. That he has dispossessed and spoiled the hopes of his lifelong friend, Mr. Wickham, who once upon a time Elizabeth had a bit of a romantic soft spot for. And also that he has blighted the happiness of Elizabeth's sister Jane by prying away the affections of his friend Mr. Bingley. And this wounds Darcy, very much so. He keeps his complete control of himself, but it wounds him. He can't trust himself even to linger. He practically bolts out of the house. And no doubt broods sleeplessly on it all night long, and then the next morning writes a long letter explaining himself to Elizabeth Bennet, and then goes out into the park waiting to see her, waiting to run into her, so that he can just hand it to her and ask her to read it. He's not going to be there with her. He's not going to explain anything himself. And she does read the letter, and then she rereads it, and then she rereads it. And it is Darcy explaining himself. It's the bulk of the last chapter that we read. And now we are in the aftermath of that. Now we are in chapter 36, which is Elizabeth in the aftermath of reading that letter. You would think off the top of your head, if you hadn't read this, you would think these are very low dramatic stakes, but oh no, nothing of the kind is true. So this is chapter 36. If Elizabeth, when Mr. Darcy gave her the letter, did not expect it to contain a renewal of his offers, she had formed no expectation at all of what its contents would be. But such as they were, it may be well supposed how eagerly she went through them, and what a contrariety of emotion they excited. Her feelings as she read were scarcely to be defined. With amazement did she first understand that he believed any apology to be in his power at all, and steadfastly was she persuaded that he could have no explanation to give which a just sense of shame would not conceal. With a strong prejudice against everything he might say, she began his account of what had happened at Netherfield. She read with an eagerness which hardly left her power of comprehension, and from impatience of knowing what the next sentence might bring, was incapable of attending to the sense of the one before her eyes. I don't know if this is true in the email world. Once upon a time, with snail mail letters, every once in a great while, there was that one letter. Couldn't get to you fast enough. You checked several times a day. And when you got it, you could not read it fast enough. This description is perfect for that. His belief of her sister's insensibility, she instantly resolved to be false. And his account of the worst objections to the match made her too angry to have any wish of doing him justice. He expressed no regret for what he had done, which satisfied her. His style was not penitent, but haughty. It was all pride and insolence. Darcy's main excuse for prying Bingley away from Jane is that he was under the impression that Jane had no reciprocal feelings for Bingley. That she didn't care for him all that much, and maybe that therefore Bingley would be breaking his heart needlessly. That's the most that he's willing to excuse himself on that matter. And he when he's talking about the objections to his own proposal to Elizabeth, he goes on at some length about the reasons why that is not a good idea. He is proposing, but he goes on at length about why that isn't a good idea, and the defects of Elizabeth's family feature prominently. Her first reading of the letter, she's saying, this is all a lie, absolutely not, this isn't good enough. But when this subject was succeeded by his account of Mr. Wickham, and when she read with somewhat clearer attention a relation of events which, if true, must overthrow every cherished opinion of his worth, and which bore so alarming an affinity to his own history of himself, her feelings were yet more acutely painful and more difficult of definition. Oddly enough, it's Wickham's own account of his past with Darcy that is damning him here, because Darcy's account is not all that different. Astonishment, apprehension, and even horror oppressed her. Keep in mind, this is all about reading a letter. How incredible is that? How absolutely incredible is that? That this is all about reading a letter, and you are breathless when you read this. She wished to discredit it entirely, repeatedly exclaiming, "This must be false. This cannot be. This must be the grossest falsehood." And when she had gone through the whole letter, though scarcely knowing anything of the last page or two, put it hastily away, protesting she would not regard it, that she would never look at it again. That resolve lasted a few seconds. In this perturbed state of mind, with thoughts that could rest on nothing, she walked on, but it would not do. In half a minute, the letter was unfolded again, and collecting herself as well as she could, she again began the mortifying perusal of all that related to Wickham, and commanded herself so far as to examine the meaning of every sentence. The account of his connection with the Pemberley family was exactly what he had related himself, and the kindness of the late Mr. Darcy, that's our Mr. Darcy's father, though she had not before known its extent, agreed equally well with his own words. Its extent was enormous. It was not only a living, but money. So far, each recital confirmed the other, but when she came to the will, the difference was great. What Wickham had said of the living was fresh in her memory, and as she recalled his very words, it was impossible not to feel that there was a gross duplicity on one side or the other. Someone is lying about what happened in the wake of the old Mr. Darcy's death. And for a few moments she flattered herself that her wishes did not err. In other words, that it's Mr. Darcy that's lying. But when she read and reread with the closest attention the particulars immediately following of Wickham's resigning all pretensions of living, of his receiving in lieu so considerable a sum as £3,000, again was she forced to hesitate. She put down the letter, weighed every circumstance with what she meant to be impartiality, deliberated on the probability of each statement, but with little success. On both sides it was only assertion. Again she read on, but every line proved more clearly that the affair, which she had believed had it impossible that any contrivance could so represent, as to render Mr. Darcy's conduct in it less than infamous, was capable of a turn which must make him entirely blameless throughout the whole. So here she's thinking, no matter what version of these events I hear from Darcy or anybody else, there's nothing that can lessen his guilt. And here she's reading an account that erases his guilt. It doesn't just lessen it. The extravagance and general profligacy which he scrupled not to lay at Mr. Wickham's charge. Just remember the line from last time, Mr. Darcy knew that Mr. Wickham should not be a clergyman. Exceedingly shocked her, and more so as she could bring no proof of its injustice. She had never heard of him before his entrance into the militia, in which he had engaged at the persuasion of a young man who, on meeting him accidentally in town, had there renewed a slight acquaintance. Of his former way of life, nothing had been known in Hertfordshire but what he told himself. As to his real character, had information been in her power, she had never felt a wish of inquiring. His countenance, his face, in other words, his voice and manner had established him at once as the possession of every virtue. Again, every time we talk about the things that reassure people when it comes to Mr. Wickham, it's how gorgeous he is. It's his face, his appearance, his voice. She tried to recollect some instance of goodness, some distinguished trait of integrity or benevolence that might rescue him from the attacks of Mr. Darcy, or at least by the predominance of virtue atone for those casual errors under which she would endeavor to class what Mr. Darcy had described as the idleness and vice of many years' continuance. In other words, she's trying to think of something about Wickham that is independently good. Something that is independently good. Apart from what he says about himself. and apart from the reason why we're told that he barely knew the friend that invites him to join the militia is because it's meant to underscore how superficial that is. The members of his militia, remember, we've been told the members of his militia like him, but they don't know him. So the equivalent here would be, the horribly negative opinion that Elizabeth has, that everybody has of Mr. Darcy, of the younger Mr. Darcy, is vitiated just a little because no one can deny his affection for his sister. So there you go. There you have a little sign of benevolence. And there's nothing like that for Wickham. Nothing at all. But no such recollection befriended her. She could see him instantly before her in every charm of air and addresses, but she could remember no more substantial good than the general approbation of the neighborhood, and the regard which his social powers had gained him in the mess. After pausing on this point a considerable while, she once more continued to read, but alas, the story which followed of his designs on Miss Darcy received some confirmation from what had passed between Colonel Fitzwilliam and herself only the morning before. And at last she was referred for the truth of every particular to Colonel Fitzwilliam himself, from whom she had previously received the information of his near concern in all his cousin's affairs, and whose character she had no reason to question. Remember, Darcy isn't just claiming this. He's saying, I will make it known to Colonel Fitzwilliam that I have sent you this letter. Feel free to talk to him about any of this. He'll confirm it. At one time, she had almost resolved on applying to him, that is, Colonel Fitzwilliam. But the idea was checked by the awkwardness of the application, and at length wholly banished by the conviction that Mr. Darcy would never have hazarded such a proposal if he had not been well assured of his cousin's corroboration. He wouldn't have made the offer if he weren't sure about it. She perfectly remembered everything that had passed in the conversation between Wickham and herself. I don't doubt it. He looks like he's been poured into that uniform. And this first evening at Mr. Phillips, many of his expressions were still fresh in her memory. She was now struck by the impropriety of such a communication to a stranger, and wondered that it had escaped her before. Remember, Wickham pours out his heart to her, tells her all his past, tells her why he has to buy a commission in the militia, tells her why he's not getting the living that he wants, why he's not part of the church, tells her all about his connections with Pemberley. And the point being made here is that why didn't it dawn on Elizabeth at the time how strange it is that you would tell all of that to a stranger? She saw the indelicacy of putting himself forward as he had done, and the inconsistency of his profession with his conduct. She remembered that he had boasted of having no fear of seeing Mr. Darcy, that Mr. Darcy might leave the country, but that he would stand his ground, and yet he had avoided the Netherfield ball the very next week. She remembered also that till the Netherfield family had quitted the country, he had told his story to no one but herself, but that after their removal it had been everywhere discussed, and that he had had no reserves, no scruple in sinking Mr. Darcy's character, though he had assured her that respect for the father would always prevent his exposing the son. Again, fantastic points, and also, I might point out, things that we saw. Jane Austen put all these things in front of us. Did you put two and two together? If you're reading this for the first time, I know the first time that I did, I didn't. The point is that you're not supposed to put those things together in the first read-through, and Jane Austen encourages you not to put them together by making Darcy so unlikable. And why is that the point? Why is she subtly encouraging you as the author not to put all those pieces together, not to see that Wickham's behavior is contradictory, that he says, I would never run down Mr. Darcy because I have such respect for his father, and then do nothing but run him down? That he would say, well, this is entirely confidential, and then as soon as Darcy's party leaves the country, he tells everybody? All these contradictions, why would Jane Austen very subtly try to get you to overlook them? She shows them to you, but she's subtly encouraging you to overlook them. Why? To make this chapter work. It isn't just Elizabeth who's going through this. It's us. We're going through this with her. How differently did everything now appear in which he was concerned? His attentions to Miss King were now the consequence of views solely and hatefully mercenary. Remember, a young woman who just came into £10,000, and suddenly Mr. Wickham drops Elizabeth with goodwill on both sides. She professes to her aunt that this is no, I understand what he's doing. I understand it perfectly. I'm not offended at all. They even talk each other, and there seem to be no hard feelings, but that is what he does, and he does it instantly. Doesn't agonize over it. And keep in mind, the reason why that's important is because that is exactly what Darcy's accusing him of doing with Darcy's own sister for 3 times the money. And the mediocrity of her fortune proved no longer the moderation of his wishes, but his eagerness to grasp at anything. We're going to see that eagerness to grasp at anything come up later in the book, disastrously. His behavior to herself could have had no tolerable motive. He had either been deceived with regards to her fortune, or had been gratifying his vanity by encouraging the preference which he believed had most incautiously shown. Every lingering struggle in his favor grew fainter and fainter, and in farther justification of Mr. Darcy, she could not but allow that Mr. Bingley, when questioned by Jane, had long ago asserted his blamelessness in the affair. That proud and repulsive as were his manners, she had never, in the whole course of their acquaintance, an acquaintance which had latterly brought them much together, and given her a sort of intimacy in his ways, seen anything that betrayed him to be unprincipled or unjust, anything that spoke of him irreligious or immoral, of his irreligious or immoral habits, that among his own connections he was esteemed and valued, that even Wickham had allowed him merit as a brother, and that she had often heard him speak so affectionately of his sister as to prove him capable of some amiable feeling. So she can't damn Darcy. People that she knows to be good like him. The people that she knows to be awful like him too, but people that she knows to be good like him. That had his actions been what Wickham represented them, so gross a violation of everything right could hardly have been concealed from the world, and that friendship between a person capable of it and such an amiable man as Mr. Bingley was incomprehensible. She grew absolutely ashamed of herself. Of neither Darcy nor Wickham could she think without feeling that she had been blind, partial, prejudiced, and absurd. "How despicably I have acted," she cried. "I, who have prided myself on my discernment, I, who have valued myself on my abilities, who have often disdained the generous candor of my sister, and gratified my vanity in useless and blamable distrust. How humiliating is this discovery, yet how just a humiliation! Had I been in love, I could not have been more wretchedly blind, but vanity, not love, has been my folly. Pleased with the preference of the one and offended by the neglect of the other, on the very beginning of our acquaintance, I have courted prepossession and ignorance, and driven reason away where either were concerned. Till this moment, I never knew myself." One of the greatest moments in English literature. Shall we read it again? Just indulge me here. I know I interrupt all the time, but let's hear that again. Let's fancy also, as I like to do, that she's saying this out loud. On a beautiful early spring day, very early spring day in a country lane, all by herself. That she's saying this out loud. How despicably I have acted. I, who have prided myself on my discernment. I, who have valued myself on my abilities. Who have often disdained in the generous candor of my sister, and gratified my vanity in useless or blamable distrust. How humiliating is this discovery, and yet how just a humiliation! Had I been in love, I could not have been more wretchedly blind, but vanity, not love, has been my folly. Pleased with the preference of the one, and offended by the neglect of the other, on the very beginning of our acquaintance, I have courted prepossession and ignorance, and driven reason away where either were concerned. Till this moment, I never knew myself. From herself to Jane, from Jane to Bingley, her thoughts were in a line which soon brought her to the recollection that Mr. Darcy's explanation there had appeared very insufficient, and she read it again. Remember, it appeared insufficient to us as well. Widely different was the effect on a second perusal. How could she deny that credit to his assertion in one instance which he had been obliged to give in the other? He declared himself to have been totally unsuspicious of her sister's attachment, and she could not help but remembering what Charlotte's opinion had always been. Neither could she deny the justice of his description of Jane, and we can't deny it either. We've seen it. Jane made a point of not showing how deeply she was affected. She felt that Jane's feelings, though fervent, were little displayed, and that there was a constant complacency in her air and manner, not often united with great sensibility. All right, so that's Jane, and then we move on to the real sore subject, her family, the rest of her family. When she came to the part of the letter in which her family were mentioned, in terms of such mortifying yet merited reproach, her sense of shame was severe. The justice of the charge struck her too forcibly for denial. and the circumstances to which he particularly alluded as having passed at the Netherfield ball, and as confirming all his first disapprobation, could not have made a stronger impression on his mind than on hers. Remember, she was mortified. So, of course, what did he think, seeing it all? The compliment to herself and her sister was not unfelt. Remember, Darcy says, no matter what anyone thinks about your family, no one thinks this about you or Jane. It soothed, but it could not console her for the contempt which had been thus self-attracted by the rest of her family. And as she considered that Jane's disappointment had been in fact the work of her nearest relations, and reflected how materially the credit of both must be hurt by such impropriety of conduct, she felt depressed beyond anything she had ever known before. In this sun-dappled country lane, we are going through this. Not a bit of action. This is a young girl reading a letter. And it is as thrilling as any war scene in Tolstoy. After wandering along the lane for 2 hours, giving way to each variety of thought, reconsidering events, determining probabilities, and reconciling herself as well as she could to a change so sudden and so important, fatigue and a recollection of her long absence made her at length return home. Here, Mr. Collins' home is what she means, Hunsford Parsonage. And she entered the house with the wish of appearing cheerful as usual, and the resolution of repressing such reflections as must make her unfit for conversation. She was immediately told that the two gentlemen from Rosings had each called during her absence, Mr. Darcy only a few minutes to take leave, but that Colonel Fitzwilliam had been sitting with them for at least an hour, hoping for her return, and almost resolving to walk after her till she could be found. Elizabeth could not but just affect concern at missing him. She really rejoiced at it. Colonel Fitzwilliam was no longer an object. She could only think of her letter. And that is chapter 36, where Elizabeth reads Darcy's letter and then thinks about it and realizes simply by going over things that he's mostly right, that she has been mostly wrong, that all the thoughts that she'd had and reconfirmed and sought to reconfirm. Remember, just a minute ago, she was rereading all of Jane's letters specifically to work up her hatred for Darcy, specifically to find all the most ammunition that she could against him. In the course of these hours out on that country lane, reading this letter alone, all of that has changed. And she now realizes that she wronged Mr. Darcy, and he's gone. He's taken his leave. He's not in the country anymore. Will she ever see him again? Is there any apology that she can make to him? A roller coaster of changes. He offered her marriage. And not only did she turn him down, but she accused him wrongly of a whole bunch of offenses. And now sees that she was wrong. And that he was right about a lot of it. Oh. All right, so there we go. We will go on to the next chapter next time. But oh my. Oh my. If this chapter doesn't do it for you, I don't know what will. But anyway, I'm going to wrap this up for now, but I'll be back. Thank you, BookTube.